The dog hit the floor and didn't get up. 110 pounds of Belgian Malinois, black tactical vest still buckled across his chest, blood spreading in a dark ring across the white linoleum of Mercy Ridge Medical Center's trauma bay. His handler, a veteran with shaking hands and hollow eyes, wasn't asking for permission. He was already inside. The animal's breathing was shallow, each exhale wetter than the last. Every administrator in that hallway said no. One nurse said nothing. She just moved. And that single, silent decision would rip open a secret she had spent 8 years burying and bring down the most powerful man in the building before the week was out. If this story already has you hooked, I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, hit that like button, and follow along so you don't miss a single part. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The shift was supposed to end at 7. Nora Callahan had been watching the clock for the last 40 minutes, not out of laziness, but out of the particular exhaustion that accumulates in a person who has been on her feet for 11 hours without sitting down once. Her sneakers were soaked through from a burst IV line in Bay 4. Her hair had given up around hour 6, escaping from its clip in pieces. She had eaten half a granola bar at 2 in the afternoon and had been quietly planning a grilled cheese sandwich with the kind of focus most people reserve for important decisions. She was standing at the nurse's station on the south end of the emergency department, finishing her charting, when the automatic doors at the ambulance bay burst open. She heard him before she saw him. "Somebody help me. Please. He's not going to make it." The voice was raw, not hysterical. Rawer than that. The sound of a man who had already run out of options and was asking anyway. Nora looked up. The veteran was broad-shouldered, maybe 40, wearing a faded army hoodie with the sleeves pushed to his elbows. His forearms were smeared with blood. He was holding the dog the way you'd carry a child, front paws draped over one arm, hindquarters supported by the other, head lolling against his chest. The animal wore a ballistic vest with a unit patch Nora recognized but couldn't immediately place, and there was a deep wound along his left flank, dark and serious, seeping through gauze that had clearly been applied in a moving vehicle. The dog's eyes were open. That was the thing that hit her. Open, unfocused, not tracking anything, just open. "Sir," the intake coordinator, Marcus, was already around the desk. "Sir, I need you to stop. This is a human emergency facility. We cannot—" "He's dying." The veteran's voice didn't rise. It stated, "He's been shot. There was an incident at the training facility outside town, and I didn't— The vet clinic is 40 minutes away, and he won't—" "Sir, I understand, but—" "Please." Nora had already moved. She wasn't running. She was walking the way she used to walk on different ground, in different clothes, in a different life, with purpose that didn't advertise itself. She crossed the floor, glanced at the dog, did a 3-second assessment that she couldn't have fully explained to anyone watching, and said quietly to the veteran, "Bay 2, come with me." Marcus turned. "Nora, get me a crash cart and a suture kit," she said, not breaking stride. "And someone call Dr. Ferris." "Nora, we cannot treat a—" "I heard you." She pushed open the bay curtain and gestured for the veteran to follow. "Come on, lay him here." The man hesitated for less than a second, then carried the dog to the trauma table and set him down with extraordinary gentleness. The animal made a sound, not quite a whimper, something lower, when his back legs touched the surface. "Talk to him," Nora said, pulling on gloves. "Keep your voice steady. He can hear you." "Zeus." The veteran's hand went immediately to the dog's head, fingers behind his ears, the way you touch something you love. "Hey, buddy. Hey, I got you. You're okay. You're okay." Nora was already cutting away the soaked gauze. The wound was bad. Not unsurvivable, but bad. A deep laceration along the left flank, possibly nicking the external oblique, with secondary trauma consistent with a hard fall onto a sharp surface. She could see the bleeding hadn't fully clotted. He was losing pressure. Whatever had happened at that training facility, it hadn't been minor. "What's his weight?" she said. The veteran blinked. 112, 113. "When did this happen?" "About 50 minutes ago. I put pressure on it the whole drive. I didn't know what else." "You did right." She was already irrigating. "What's his name?" "Zeus." "I got that part. What's yours?" A pause. Garrett! Garrett Vaughn! Okay, Garrett, I need you to keep doing exactly what you're doing. Talk to him, keep him calm, don't let him try to move. Are you... Can you actually... I don't know yet. She said it honestly, without softening it. But I'm not stopping until I do. She heard footsteps behind her. Marcus again, and someone else. Delia, the charge nurse, older, expression already hardened into something that meant trouble. Nora, step away from the patient. In a minute. Now. Delia's voice was the voice of someone who had filed incident reports before and was already composing this one in her head. This is a direct violation of... He's in hemorrhagic shock. Nora didn't look up. If we move him right now, he will die on that floor. Give me 10 minutes. You do not have authorization to... Then get me someone who does. Silence. The kind that means someone is deciding how much trouble they want. Then Delia said very quietly, "This is going on record. Write whatever you need to." Nora finally looked up, met her eyes for 1 second. After. It took her 9 minutes, not because she was slow, because the wound was deeper than it initially presented, with a secondary bleed from a vessel she had to identify by feel before she could address it, and because her hands had to relearn a language they hadn't spoken in years. The specific grammar of trauma work done fast, under pressure, with imperfect supplies and no ideal conditions. Her hands remembered anyway. That was the thing about that kind of training. It didn't leave. It went quiet, settled somewhere underneath the daily routine of IV lines and discharge paperwork and patient intake forms, and waited. 8 years of waiting. And now her hands were moving the way they had moved in a different country, on different patients, in situations she had never told anyone here about. Garrett Vaughn stood at Zeus's head the entire time, one hand on the dog's skull, talking in a low, continuous murmur. He didn't ask questions. He didn't get in the way. He just stayed present, the way a soldier stays present. Not because the situation isn't terrifying, but because leaving isn't an option. When the primary bleed was controlled and the wound was properly packed and dressed, Nora stepped back, stripped off her outer gloves, and exhaled through her nose. "He needs a veterinary surgeon," she said. "The wound's stabilized, but there's possible internal involvement I can't assess without imaging equipment calibrated for his size. He needs imaging, he needs IV fluids, and he needs a specialist within the next 2 hours." Garrett was staring at her. "He's going to make it?" "I think so, but I'm not a vet, and I'm not going to give you a guarantee I can't back up." She met his eyes. "What I can tell you is that he's not dying in the next 20 minutes, which he was before." The veteran's throat worked. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "How did you know how to do that?" Nora was already turning away. "I used to know a lot of things. The closest emergency animal hospital is on Meridian Road, about 12 miles north. I'll have Marcus print you directions." "I don't..." He stopped. "I need to ask you something." "Later. Right now you need to get him into your vehicle and get moving." She looked at Zeus, who was breathing more steadily now, still dazed but present, his dark eyes moving slowly toward Garrett's face. "He's going to want to see you when he wakes up properly. Don't be somewhere else." Garrett nodded. He looked down at Zeus, and something in his expression shifted. Something private. The way emotion moves across a face when a person thinks no one is watching. He was wrong about that. Nora saw it. She felt it somewhere behind her sternum and moved on. She was washing her hands at the utility sink when the door opened. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The footsteps were deliberate, the pace of someone who has decided on an outcome before entering the room. She'd worked at Mercy Ridge for 3 years. She knew the sound of Director Wallace Greer's approach, the way you know the sound of weather changing. She turned around anyway. Greer was 56, silver-haired, impeccably dressed for a man who had presumably been called back to the hospital on a Tuesday evening. He had the particular posture of someone who had never been questioned by anyone whose opinion he respected, and the expression of someone who was currently deciding how large to make an example. Standing beside him was Delia and Marcus, and a woman Nora didn't recognize in a hospital administration lanyard. "Nurse Callahan," Greer said. His voice was controlled, more controlled than she expected, which was somehow worse. "I'm going to need you to explain what happened in Bay 2. A critically injured animal came in with a veteran handler, I assessed an active hemorrhage and intervened to stabilize the patient before transport. The patient. He said the word with a specific kind of emphasis that he clearly thought was devastating. The animal, she corrected, without flinching. He was in hemorrhagic shock. Moving him without stabilization would have killed him. That is not your determination to make. Greer took 2 steps into the room. This facility does not treat animals. That policy exists for legal, insurance, and public health reasons that I should not have to explain to a third-year floor nurse. I know the policy. Then you made a deliberate choice to violate it. Yes, no qualifier. No apology wrapped around it, just the word clean and unadorned. Greer's expression shifted slightly. He had been expecting something else. An explanation, maybe. A defense. Something he could argue with. You used hospital supplies, he said. You occupied a trauma bay. You exposed this facility to liability that I am not. He would have died. Her voice was still even. In front of his handler, on our floor, with staff watching. I made a call. You can decide what to do with that. A silence. Delia was looking at the floor. Marcus had the expression of someone who wanted very badly to be somewhere else. The administrator in the lanyard was writing something on a clipboard. I am deciding right now, Greer said. You're suspended pending review. Badge. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she unclipped her badge from her scrubs and held it out. He didn't take it directly. He gestured to the clipboard woman, who stepped forward and took it with 2 fingers, like it was something she didn't want to touch. Collect your personal belongings from your locker, Greer said. You'll be contacted by HR within 48 hours. Security will escort you out. All right. She pulled her hands from the sink, dried them on a paper towel, and dropped it in the bin. The wound site will need to be checked by the veterinary team when they assess him. I've noted the vessel involved. I can write a summary of the intervention if that would help the receiving vet. Greer stared at her. You are not currently employed by this hospital. I know, she said. I meant for the dog. She walked past him toward the door. The locker room was empty. Nora sat on the bench for a moment before she opened her locker, not because she was composing herself. She was already composed, which was its own kind of strange, but because she needed a second to recalibrate what was happening. She had known, somewhere between the irrigation and the suturing, that this was going to happen. The knowledge had been there, quiet and clear, like reading a map. She had chosen to keep moving anyway. The calculation had been simple. The dog lives or the dog dies. Everything else could be dealt with after. She pulled out her street shoes, her jacket, the small framed photo she kept on the top shelf, her younger brother at a graduation, grinning in a way he didn't do anymore. She put it in her bag. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She considered not answering, then did. Callahan, a voice she didn't recognize. Male, flat, professional in the way that comes from institutional training rather than customer service. Is this Nora Callahan? Former Sergeant, 75th Medical Support Unit, attached to Task Force assignments 2014 through 2017? The locker room got very quiet. Who is this? She said. I'll explain when we're in person. A pause. I understand you had an eventful evening. How do you know what? The dog you saved tonight isn't a pet. Another pause, brief but deliberate. His name is really Zeus. His full designation is MWD Zeus, military working dog, serial number Delta 7 Foxtrot. He's been deployed in 4 countries and has been credited with 31 IED detections. The voice was measured, precise. The team he belongs to has been looking for him for 6 hours. Nora stood very still. The handler, she said, Vaughn, is one of ours. He'll explain more when you speak. Another beat. We're currently 20 minutes out from Mercy Ridge. We need you to stay in the building. She looked at the door to the locker room. Beyond it, somewhere, a security guard was waiting to escort her out. I've been suspended, she said. We know. A pause she couldn't read. That won't be a problem. The call ended. Nora sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the photo of her brother on the top of her bag. Outside the locker room, she could hear the distant sounds of the ER. Monitors, voices, the mechanical beep of something being answered. The ordinary noise of the place she had just been removed from. She put her phone in her jacket pocket. Then she sat back down on the bench and waited. 12 minutes later, she heard the doors. Not the automatic slide of the ambulance bay, the manual push of the main entrance, a sound that carried differently, heavier, accompanied by the particular quality of silence that moves through a room when people stop what they're doing without understanding why. She knew that silence. She had heard it before, on the other side of a different door, in a different building, a long time ago. She picked up her bag, stood, and walked back out into the hallway. There were 6 of them. They weren't in uniform. That was the first thing. Civilian clothes, dark, nothing that advertised anything. But there was no disguising what they were. It lived in the way they moved through the space, not aggressive, not showy, just utterly certain of where they were going and completely unimpressed by anything in their path. The kind of movement that came from years of entering rooms where things were wrong. The ER staff had stopped. A nurse near the station was holding a chart against her chest like a shield. Marcus had stepped back from the desk. Even Delia, who had been standing near the corridor with the expression of a woman running out the clock on someone else's disaster, had gone quiet. The man at the front of the group was roughly Nora's age, maybe a year or 2 older, with a jaw that hadn't been introduced to softness, and eyes that were doing the kind of rapid environmental assessment she recognized from training exercises and from real ones. He was the one who had called her. He looked directly at her. "Sergeant Callahan," he said. Behind him, one of the others, a tall man with a red scar along his left temple, turned his head and looked at her hands. And something moved across his face that she couldn't fully interpret. Not recognition, exactly. Something older than that. From somewhere down the hall, she heard Greer's voice before she saw him. "Who authorized these people to enter through the—" He came around the corner, stopped, looked at the 6 men. His face did something complicated. The man at the front didn't look at Greer. He kept his eyes on Nora. "We need to talk," he said. "All of us." The hallway held its breath. Greer said, with the last of his authority, "This is a medical facility. You cannot simply—" The man with the scar turned slowly and looked at Greer, just looked at him. Greer stopped talking. The man at the front, Nora still didn't know his name, took a single step toward her and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Zeus is alive because of you. We know what you did tonight, and we know what you did before tonight." A pause. Some of us were there. The red-scarred man was still looking at her hands. And she remembered, suddenly and completely, a dirt road outside a burning vehicle, a man with a wound she had packed with her bare hands in the dark, a face she had never seen again after the medevac lifted. Until now. The overhead lights buzzed. Somewhere behind Greer, the clipboard woman had her phone out. Nora looked at the man in front of her and said, very quietly, "How bad was it?" "Zeus, when Vaughn brought him in. Bad enough that they're calling it a miracle he made it to your door." She absorbed that. "He still needs a veterinary surgeon. He's already with one." The man almost smiled. It didn't quite get there. "We don't leave our people behind, any of them." Greer had recovered enough to find his voice again. "I don't know who you people think you are, but this nurse has been suspended for a serious policy violation. And if you are here to interfere with an internal HR, Batskikikabat." The man at the front turned and looked at Greer for the first time. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him for approximately 4 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a card that he held out between 2 fingers without moving toward Greer, making him come forward to take it. Greer took it. Read it. His face changed in a way that Nora hadn't seen on it before. The man turned back to Nora. "We have some things to discuss," he said, "and I think your director is going to want to be present for most of it." Down the hall, beyond the sliding doors, more headlights were pulling into the parking lot. A lot of headlights. And Nora Callahan, who had spent 8 years being nobody in particular, stood in the hallway of the hospital that had just fired her and felt the particular sensation of a buried thing pressing upward through the surface. Not relief. Not yet. Something more complicated than that. The specific feeling of a story that has been waiting in the dark a long time, finally deciding to move toward the light. The man's name was Decker. He said it once, without a title attached, and didn't offer a hand to shake. That told Nora something. Men like him didn't perform introduction rituals in moments like this one. The name was functional, nothing more. A way to be addressed in a room where he intended to do most of the directing. "Is there a conference room in this building?" he asked. Nora glanced at Greer, who was still holding the card and doing an impression of a man who had recently discovered that the ground under his feet was not as solid as advertised. "There's an admin conference room on the second floor," she said. "Main corridor, east wing. Lead the way." Greer found his voice. "You cannot commandeer hospital facilities for—" "Mr. Greer." Decker said it without looking at him, the way you say the name of something you've already accounted for. "You can come with us and participate in a conversation, or you can stay here and have a different conversation later with people you'll find less agreeable. Either is fine with me." A beat. Greer came with them. The 6 men moved through the ER corridor in a loose formation that was casual enough not to alarm anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. The staff watched them pass. Nobody said anything. The man with the scar, Nora still didn't know his name, walked at the back of the group, and twice she felt him looking at her, though every time she glanced back his eyes were elsewhere. She knew that trick too. The conference room on the second floor was used primarily for budget presentations and the kind of quarterly meetings that existed to justify their own existence. There was a long table, 12 chairs, a whiteboard with old marker residue that someone had wiped but not erased properly, and a projector that probably hadn't worked since the previous decade. Decker didn't sit. Neither did 3 of his men, who positioned themselves at the edges of the room in a way that was relaxed but deliberate. Greer sat at the head of the table out of habit and seemed to realize immediately that this was a mistake. Nora took a chair in the middle. She put her bag on the floor beside her. She was still wearing her scrubs because she hadn't gotten as far as changing before the call came in, and she was aware of the fact that she smelled like antiseptic and dried blood and a very long shift, and she did not care about this at all. Decker set a tablet on the table and turned it to face the room. On the screen was a photograph. A dog. Zeus, unmistakably, though younger, the muzzle less gray, wearing a vest with a different patch than the one he'd had tonight. He was standing in what looked like a forward operating base, surrounded by men in full kit, and every single one of them was grinning. "Military working dog Zeus, Delta 7 Foxtrot," Decker said. "He's been deployed to 3 countries in the last 6 years. His last overseas assignment involved EOD support for a 12-month rotation, where his detections directly prevented 4 confirmed mass casualty events." He paused. "He's also the kind of dog that when you're in a forward position in the dark and things go sideways, you notice where he is before you notice where anything else is. Because if Zeus is calm, you're probably fine. And if Zeus isn't calm," he let that sit. "His handler, Garrett Vaughn, has worked with him for 4 years. Vaughn doesn't use another dog, hasn't been asked to." Greer said, "This is all I'm sure the animal is significant, but the issue here is that a staff member violated clear protocol." "Mr. Greer." Decker still wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the tablet. "I'm going to get to you. I need you to wait." The way he said it made waiting sound like the only reasonable thing left to do. Greer waited. Decker advanced the image on the tablet. The next photograph was different. Older, lower quality. The kind of image that came from a field camera rather than anything official. It showed a narrow street, a vehicle on its side, smoke at the edges of the frame. In the foreground, barely visible, were 2 figures crouched behind a concrete barrier. One was clearly a soldier. The other was a woman in medical kit, her face turned slightly away from the camera, working on something that the frame didn't fully show. Nora recognized the street. She didn't recognize the photograph. She had not known, until this moment, that anyone had been taking pictures. "Task Force Meridian," Decker said. "Coast Province, 2016. He finally looked at her. "You were attached as forward medical support for 6 weeks. During that time, you managed 14 field interventions, 2 of which were performed under direct fire. One of those soldiers is currently active duty. Another one left the service and works search and rescue in Montana." A pause. "Another one is standing at the back of this room." She didn't turn around. She knew who he meant. "You were put in for a commendation twice," Decker continued. "Both times the paperwork was caught in a classification review and never cleared. By the time the review concluded, you'd already left the service." "I know," she said. "You know. I left for reasons." "I know your reasons." He said it without judgment, just acknowledgement. They were solid reasons. Greer had been following this exchange with the expression of a man watching a film in a language he doesn't speak and gradually realizing the subtitles are about him. "What does any of this?" he started. "What this means," Decker said, finally giving him his full attention, "is that the nurse you suspended tonight, the one you marched out of her department with a security escort for saving a decorated military working dog, has a service record that most people in this building will never come close to. And the dog she saved has a service record that most people in this country will never hear about." He picked up the tablet. "Both of those things are going to matter in about an hour, when the people I made calls to on the way here start making calls of their own." Greer's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening this institution?" "I'm describing a situation." Decker set the tablet down. "The situation is that you have a choice in how the next 24 hours unfold. That choice has consequences either way. I'm trying to help you make it with accurate information because I've found that people make better choices when they have the full picture." He looked at Greer steadily. "Do you want the full picture?" A long silence. "Yes," Greer said, though he looked like a man agreeing to open a door he could already hear something moving behind. The full picture took 40 minutes. Decker was precise and methodical in the way of someone who has briefed hostile rooms before and knows that the most effective tool available is specificity. He didn't editorialize. He laid out facts in sequence, one after another, without dramatic emphasis, and let the weight of the accumulation do the work. Zeus's deployment record, his detection history, the names of units he'd supported and the names of operations those units had been part of, most redacted for security reasons, but the outlines visible enough to carry meaning. The training facility incident that had brought Vaughn through the doors of Mercy Ridge, a routine force-on-force exercise that had gone wrong when Zeus hit a section of collapsed fencing at speed, the edge catching his flank, a wound that had opened faster and deeper than anyone in the field had anticipated. Vaughn had made a judgment call. The nearest veterinary facility was 40 minutes out. Mercy Ridge was 6. "He didn't come here because he thought it would work," Decker said. "He came here because Zeus would have died in the truck." Greer said nothing. Nurse Callahan intervened. She controlled the bleed, stabilized the patient, and gave specific instructions to the receiving veterinary team regarding the wound site. Decker looked at Nora briefly. The vet said her notes were the most useful pre-treatment documentation he'd received on an emergency presentation in 4 years. Nora absorbed this without changing her expression. The man with the scar, she knew his name now, had figured it out about 10 minutes into the briefing when Decker referenced him indirectly. Reyes. Corporal Marcus Reyes, as he'd been then. She'd packed the exit wound on his shoulder in the back of a vehicle with no overhead light, using her knee to hold pressure while she worked because both her hands were occupied. She hadn't known if he'd make it until 3 weeks later, when she got a field message that said, "Guy from the truck says thanks." She had never been given a name. Now he was standing 12 feet away in a civilian jacket, and he hadn't said a word since they entered the building, and she understood that too. There were things that didn't resolve themselves into conversation easily. Some experiences sat in you at a depth where language didn't quite reach. Greer had his hands flat on the table. "What exactly is it that you want from this meeting?" "Nurse Callahan's reinstatement," Decker said. "Immediate, with no mark on her record for tonight's events. The liability exposure from what happened in that will be resolved through channels I won't bore you with." Decker's tone didn't change. "There are frameworks for this kind of thing. Facilities that provide emergency medical support for military working dogs in situations involving imminent loss of life are covered under provisions that your legal team will find when they look, because tonight is going to prompt them to look very carefully." "Well," he paused. "What won't be covered is a director who terminated a decorated veteran, which is what she is, even if you didn't know it, for saving a decorated military asset in a situation where inaction would have resulted in the animal's death." Greer looked at Nora with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't apology. It wasn't the straightforward calculation of someone doing damage control. It was something more complicated. The look of a man realizing that the thing he thought he understood, he did not understand at all. "I wasn't aware of her background," he said. "No," Decker agreed. "You weren't." A silence settled over the table. Outside the windows, the parking lot was lit amber, and Nora could see 2 vehicles that hadn't been there an hour ago. Dark SUVs parked at the far edge, engine off, no visible occupants. Watching, maybe. Or waiting. She wasn't sure which. I'll need to consult with our legal department before Greer started. You have until 8 a.m., Decker said. After 8 a.m., the first call I described becomes a second call, which goes to someone who makes a third call, and by mid-morning, you'll be managing that instead of this. He stood. This is the easier conversation, Mr. Greer. I'd recommend keeping it this one. He looked at Nora. We'll be in the building until this resolves, he said. It wasn't a question. Okay, she said. He nodded once and moved toward the door, two of his men ahead of him. The others stayed. Reyes stayed. When it was down to Greer, Nora, and the two remaining men at the edges of the room, the director sat in silence for a moment, looking at the middle distance above the table. You should have told me, he said finally. Nora looked at him. About what? Your background, your service record. If I had known, it wouldn't have changed what I did tonight. It might have changed how I responded to it. Maybe. She picked up her bag from the floor. But I shouldn't have to have a classified service record for the math to work out. A dog was dying. I stopped him dying. That's the whole calculation. Greer didn't answer. She stood and walked to the door and then stopped because she'd thought of something. My badge, she said. The woman took it downstairs. Greer reached into his jacket pocket. He'd had it the whole time, had taken it from the clipboard woman before coming upstairs, apparently, though she didn't know when or why. He set it on the table between them. She picked it up. The waiting area outside the second-floor conference room had 3 chairs and a potted plant that was optimistically alive. Nora sat in one of the chairs and turned her badge over in her hands and didn't think about anything specific, which was a skill she had developed over years and found useful in moments that asked too much of direct thought. Reyes came out of the conference room about 5 minutes after she did. He stood in the corridor for a moment before he sat down in the chair across from her. He moved carefully, the way people move when they've had enough injuries to have learned patience with their own body. Neither of them said anything for a while. Montana, she finally said. He glanced at her. Decker said one of the guys from the task force is in Montana doing search and rescue. I was trying to figure out who. She paused. Birchall? Reyes almost smiled. Yeah, Birchall. He seemed like a Montana person. He seems like he's good at it. He shifted his weight slightly. I didn't know you were here, in Harwick. I didn't know you were in Colorado at all. I didn't exactly send out a forwarding address. No. He looked at the floor. I never got to thank you. The field message, that wasn't. It was enough. It wasn't. He said it simply, not self-flagellating about it, just honest. I know it wasn't. I just didn't have access to anything else at the time. Reyes. She waited until he looked at her. You being upright and annoying Greer is thank you enough. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The thing that's adjacent to a smile in people who don't deploy them frequently. He's going to reinstate you, Reyes said. I know. Decker's not wrong about the legal coverage. There's precedent. And the exposure from not reinstating you is significant. I know that too. She looked at her badge. That's not what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about? She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was layered in a way that was hard to organize quickly, and she wasn't sure she wanted to hand him all of it. I'm thinking about Vaughn, she said, whether Zeus made it through the initial assessment. He did. Decker got an update in the car on the way over. Zeus is in surgery, but the prognosis is good. The vet said whoever stabilized him in the field knew what they were doing. She let that settle. It was the information she'd been holding space for all evening, she realized. The outcome she had made the decision for, the one she hadn't let herself think about too directly because she couldn't control it. Good, she said. Then after a moment, what happens now? With tonight? With the... Decker will manage the institutional side. Reyes leaned back slightly. The media side is going to happen regardless of what Greer decides. There are people in that unit who found out what happened tonight, and they're not the type to stay quiet about it. By morning, there will be a story. He looked at her directly. You should be prepared for that. I've never wanted to be a story. I know. A pause. But Zeus has 31 confirmed detections, and the unit has been trying to get him a public commendation for 2 years, and the paperwork keeps dying in review. Tonight gives them a hook. He paused. And you're part of the hook. She considered this. She understood it. She didn't have to like it. I'll deal with it, she said. Yeah. He stood slowly. I know you will. He started back toward the conference room, then stopped. The shoulder, he said, without turning around. I still get pain. More than they said I would. A pause. But it works. Everything works. He glanced back over his shoulder at her. I want you to know that. She nodded. He went back inside. Note. Greer emerged from the conference room at just after 10:15. He had the look of a man who had spent the preceding hour in a room that reconfigured him somewhat. Not broken, not yet, but rearranged. The confidence was still present. It was structural in him, woven into the way he held his shoulders. But it had developed qualifications it hadn't had before. He found Nora where she'd been since Reyes went back in. She'd moved from the chair to the window at some point, watching the parking lot below, where one of the dark SUVs had been joined by a third vehicle that looked official in a way she couldn't specify. The color, maybe, or the antenna placement. Nurse Callahan. He stopped a few feet from her. This was already different from earlier. Earlier, he hadn't stopped at a respectful distance. He'd moved through the space as though he owned the geometry of it. Mr. Greer, I've spoken with our legal counsel. He said it carefully. Given the circumstances and given the nature of the animal involved in the specific medical situation, I'm prepared to reinstate your employment immediately, with this evening's events classified as an emergency medical judgment call under extenuating circumstances. She waited. Your record will reflect no disciplinary action, he added, the way someone adds a thing they've been told to add. There will be a formal review of the relevant policies to determine whether protocol guidance needs to be updated for situations involving military working animals. Thank you, she said, because it was what you said. I want to be clear, he said, and she heard something in it that wasn't entirely performance, some minor frequency of genuine feeling, which surprised her slightly. Had I known about your background, tonight would have been handled differently. I believe you, she said, and she mostly did, because it was probably true, and also because the thing she had spent the most energy believing tonight wasn't about Greer at all. He nodded once, awkwardly, and went back inside. She looked at her badge again, clipped it back onto her scrubs. The night shift nurses who had been there for the original incident had filtered back to their stations by the time Nora came back down to the first floor. The ER had kept moving the way it always did. Emergencies don't pause for institutional drama, but the particular quality of attention in the room had changed. People looked at her differently than they had 3 hours ago. Not the way she wanted to be looked at necessarily, but differently. Marcus was at the desk and had the grace to look neither triumphant nor abashed, just present, which she appreciated. Hey, he said. Hey. You good? Getting there. She stopped at the desk. How's the board? Manageable. Bay 3's been waiting on a CT. Bay 6 just cleared. He paused. Delia went home. She said she wasn't feeling well. Nora processed this. Okay. She left a note on the staffing board. He hesitated. It just says see administration. I don't know if that's about you or something else. I'll deal with it tomorrow. She was already moving toward the supply room to check what needed restocking. An automatic behavior, the instinct to be useful before anything else, when her phone buzzed. Garrett Vaughn. She almost didn't answer, then did. He's out of surgery, Vaughn said immediately. His voice was different from earlier, still rough, but the desperation had been replaced with something looser. They said it was cleaner than they expected going in. They said whatever was done beforehand, the stabilization, they said it made the surgery easier. I'm glad. I need to... He stopped. I've been trying to figure out what to say since the parking lot, and I still don't have it. You don't need to say anything, Vaughn. I really do. A pause long enough to have something in it. I know about your record. Decker told me in the car when I was on the phone with the vet. I didn't know when I came in here tonight. I just knew I was out of options. His voice shifted again, finding something steadier. But I know now. And I know what you gave up to help him. And I know what you've given before. And I... He stopped again. Zeus saved 4 of my guys from a device that would have ended them. 4. I get to go home to them because of him. And I get to... He couldn't finish it. Go be with him, Nora said. When he wakes up, he needs to see you first. Everything else can wait. A long silence. Yeah, Vaughn said. Yeah, okay. He hung up. Nora stood in the supply room with her phone and looked at the orderly shelves and breathed. Then she started checking inventory. It took her about 4 minutes to notice that the IV supply log had a 3-week discrepancy she'd been trying to get Greer's office to address since August, and the frustration of the mundane problem was almost comforting. Something specific and fixable and entirely within the ordinary register of things. She was writing the discrepancy down when she heard footsteps in the doorway. She expected a nurse, or Marcus. It was Decker. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd learned over the last several hours was his version of careful. Reinstatements confirmed, he said. I know. Greer told me. Legal's going to want a statement from you in the next few days, routine, regarding the emergency circumstances. Fine. He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man with more to say who was deciding whether this was the right time for it. Say it, she said. Tomorrow morning there's going to be coverage, he said. Not just local. The unit has contacts and people talk, and Zeus has a story that journalists know how to write. You're in that story. Reyes told me. What Reyes didn't tell you, because I hadn't told him yet, when you two were in the hall. He paused. The commendation review that's been stalled for 2 years. The office that handles those received a call tonight from someone whose name I won't say, who has a significant amount of influence over how those reviews move. He looked at her directly. Zeus's commendation is going to clear. And the review of your own service record, the 2 commendations that died in classification, they're going to be re-examined. Nora was quiet. That's going to take time, she said. Yes. I'm not... She stopped, reconsidered. I didn't do any of it for commendations. I know. He said it without patronizing her. But it matters that the record is accurate, especially now that the record is going to be visible. She looked at the inventory sheet in her hands. The supply discrepancy. 3 weeks of mislogged IV bags, August to present. Decker, she said. Yeah. Who took the photograph? The one from 2016, the street and cost. He was quiet for a moment. One of the team, he said. He takes photographs of everything. Always has. It makes people uncomfortable and nobody ever makes him stop because his photography has also been the only documentation of several events that mattered later. That image, you've had it since 2016, since about 2017. When the review closed and we were going through archival documentation, his photographs got pulled in with everything else. Did you know it was me in the photograph? Not until recently. He paused. Not until I heard tonight what hospital Vaughn was driving toward, and I pulled the file on a nurse named Callahan at Mercy Ridge, and something matched. She absorbed this. That's a hell of a coincidence, she said. Yeah. He looked at the door behind him, then back at her. Or Zeus knows what he's doing. He left before she could respond. She stood in the supply room holding the inventory sheet, and the thought settled over her slowly and without drama. That 8 years of quiet had been shaken in the space of a single shift, and she did not yet know what shape anything would take on the other side of it. And the not knowing was both unsettling and completely familiar, because she had lived in not knowing before, in worse places, with worse odds, and had come out with her hands still functional. That had always been enough. She went back to the inventory. At midnight, she took her break. She hadn't eaten since the granola bar at 2, and the grilled cheese had progressed in her imagination from fantasy to actual plan. But the cafeteria was closed, and the vending machine on the second floor produced a sandwich of ambiguous age that she ate anyway, sitting on a bench near the stairwell. Her phone buzzed 3 times in a row. Unknown numbers. Not the same one as before. She didn't answer. Decker had predicted this, and she trusted that he hadn't made that prediction carelessly. The last buzz was a text, not a call. This is Vaughn. He's awake. He's looking around. Vet says it's a very good sign. Just wanted you to know." She looked at the text for a moment. Then she looked up at the stairwell ceiling and exhaled something that had been waiting in her chest since a dog hit the floor and didn't get up. She texted back, "Good." She finished the sandwich. Peptides. She was back on the floor at midnight when Delia's note on the staffing board stopped being about Delia. Marcus found her in Bay 4, and his expression was the careful, contained expression of someone delivering news that could go multiple directions. "There's something you should see," he said. He held out his phone. On the screen was a news alert. Local channel, posted 17 minutes ago. The headline read, "Harwick nurse fired for treating military K9. Was herself a decorated combat medic." Beneath it, a photograph. Not the 2016 Coast photograph. A different one. Older. Her in full medical kit at a forward operating base she recognized, standing next to a man she remembered, both of them squinting against desert sun, both of them smiling in the exhausted, slightly unhinged way you smiled when something had just almost gone very wrong and hadn't. She didn't know who had released it. She didn't know which of the 17 calls she hadn't answered had been the journalist. She looked at the photograph and thought, "There it is." "It's already been shared 4,000 times, Marcus said quietly. She handed his phone back. "I know," she said. She went back to Bay 4 to finish the IV line she'd been about to start, because the patient in Bay 4 had been waiting long enough, and the rest of it would still be there when she was done. And she had learned a long time ago that the way through a situation was never around the thing directly in front of you. She was halfway through the line when her pager went off. Not a patient alert, an administration code, Greer's extension, at 12:43 in the morning. She finished the IV line, checked the patient, and then walked to the phone at the nursing station and called the extension. Greer picked up on the first ring. "I need you upstairs," he said. His voice was different from the last time she'd heard it. The last time it had been rearranged, but still structurally intact. Now it sounded like a building in which something load-bearing had shifted. "What's happened?" she said. A pause. "Just come up," he said. "Please." She had been doing this work long enough to know that please from Greer was not a small thing. She handed the station back to Marcus and took the stairs. The second-floor conference room had more people in it than before. Decker was back, and two of his men. There was a woman she didn't recognize, older, in civilian clothes that looked expensive in a restrained way, sitting at the far end of the table with a laptop open. And there was a man in uniform, not combat uniform, dress uniform, whom she had also never seen, with the kind of rank insignia that made people sit differently in rooms. Greer was standing near the window. He didn't look at her when she entered. The woman at the laptop looked up. "Nurse Callahan," she said. "Sit down. We need to talk about what was found on the security server this evening." Nora looked at Decker. His expression gave away exactly nothing. She sat. The woman turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a grid of security camera footage timestamps. Internal Mercy Ridge footage, the kind that lived on servers and was rarely accessed unless something needed to be proved. The timestamps ran back months. Some were highlighted. "We weren't looking for this," the woman said. "But when we pulled the footage from tonight for the formal record, the system flagged corrupted files. Our technician looked into the corruption." She paused. "What he found is that someone with administrative access has been selectively deleting security footage on a regular basis going back approximately 14 months. Nora looked at Greer. He was still looking at the window. "The files that were deleted," the woman continued, "correspond to dates and times that overlap with 11 internal HR incidents. Complaints filed by staff members, 2 of which involve patient care concerns." She closed the laptop. "Director Greer has been made aware of this finding." A silence that had weight. "The commendation review for your service record has been formally initiated," the woman added, as though this were a footnote and not the sentence Nora had been waiting for without knowing it. "But that's not why I asked you up here." She looked at her directly. "The hospital board has been notified of tonight's events. All of them. They're convening an emergency session at 7 a.m. Nora looked at the footage grid, still visible at the edge of the laptop screen. 14 months of selected deletions. 11 complaints. 2 patient care concerns. She thought about Delia, who had left a note on the staffing board and gone home sick. She thought about Marcus, who had stepped back from the desk and looked at the floor during the confrontation in Bay 2. She thought about the 4 nurses who had left the department in the last 18 months, each one walking out with the particular quietness of people who have decided that fighting is not worth the cost. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Right now?" "Nothing," the woman said. "We need you to be aware of the situation and to be available for the board meeting in the morning. I have a shift. We'll arrange coverage." Nora looked at the window where Greer was standing. He hadn't moved. He was looking at the parking lot in the way of a man watching something he built slowly, becoming something he can no longer recognize. She almost felt something for him. Almost. "Is there anything else tonight?" she asked. "No," the woman said. Nora stood. She was almost at the door when the woman spoke again. "Nurse Callahan." She stopped. "The footage that was deleted, one of the incidents involved a complaint made by a member of your own department, filed 9 months ago." The woman paused. "Regarding a patient care decision that was overruled by administration. The complaint alleged that the overruling put a patient at risk." Nora turned. "Who filed it?" she asked. The woman glanced at her laptop. "A nurse named Petra Ndulu," she said. "She resigned 6 weeks after filing it." Nora knew the name. She'd worked 3 shifts with Petra Ndulu in her first year at Mercy Ridge. Sharp, careful, the kind of nurse who double-checked everything not from anxiety, but from principle. She'd left without explanation, and Nora had assumed it was a better offer somewhere. "Is she—" "She's been contacted," the woman said. "She'll be at the board meeting." Nora stood with her hand on the doorframe and understood that tonight had not been one thing unfolding, but several things that had been waiting separately in the dark, and that the dog hitting the floor had been the moment they all started moving toward the same light at the same time. She went back down to the ER. She had 4 hours left on her shift. She worked them. And at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the board convened, her phone received a text from an unknown number, different from the earlier ones, with a different area code. It contained 3 words and a photograph. He found it. The photograph was Zeus, awake, vest off, lying on a padded veterinary table with his head in Garrett Vaughn's lap. His eyes were open and tracking. His tail, visible at the edge of the frame, was moving. Nora stood at the nurse's station and looked at it. Then she put the phone in her pocket, picked up the chart she'd been about to update, and finished the note she'd been writing. When she looked up, Marcus was watching her. "Everything okay?" he said. "Getting there," she said. She put the chart down and walked toward the elevator, because the board was waiting, and Petra Ndulu was waiting, and whatever was underneath 14 months of deleted footage was waiting, and she was done letting things wait any longer than they already had. The elevator took 40 seconds to reach the 4th floor. Nora counted them without meaning to, an old habit from different situations, the kind where you counted things because counting was the only form of control available. 40 seconds, a short walk down a carpeted corridor she'd never been on before, and then the boardroom door, which was already open. The room was larger than the conference room downstairs. Actual boardroom furniture, a table that cost more than 6 months of her salary, chairs with the particular posture of institutional authority, the kind that made people sit straighter without deciding to. 7 people were already seated when she walked in. She recognized the woman with the laptop from the night before, now positioned at the right of the head chair. Decker was in the back corner, not at the table, in the stance of someone who is present as a resource rather than a participant. Rhea stood near the window again, which she was beginning to think was just where he went when he needed to be in a room without committing to it. The remaining 5 were board members she'd seen photographs of in the annual report that lived in the staff break room and that she'd never read beyond the first page. Chairman Bernard Holt was at the head, 70s, the kind of lean that came from decades of early mornings, with the expression of a man who had been woken up by a phone call at an unpleasant hour and had spent the intervening time deciding how to feel about it. Sitting at the far end of the table, against the wall rather than at it, was Petra Ndulu. She was smaller than Nora remembered, or maybe it was the room. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her shoulders in the careful, neutral position of someone who has rehearsed being in a room like this, and when Nora came through the door, she looked up, and something in her face shifted. Not relief, but the recognition of another person in the same situation, the way 2 people in a foreign country recognize each other's accent. Nora sat in the chair nearest the door. No one told her where to go, and she wasn't going to work her way toward the head of the table like she had something to prove. Holt looked at her for a moment, evaluating. "Nurse Callahan," he said, "I've been reviewing your file since 4 this morning." "I imagine it was a short read," she said. A beat. Something that wasn't quite amusement moved across his face. "Shorter than it should have been," he said, "which is part of what we're addressing today." He folded his hands on the table. "I want to be clear about what this meeting is and what it isn't. It's not a disciplinary hearing. It's not a press event. It is an emergency board session to review a series of findings that came to our attention last night, including but not limited to the events in the emergency department." He looked around the table. "Director Greer will join us shortly. His counsel is traveling from Denver and will be participating remotely." Iggy. Nora looked at the empty chair. His counsel. That had moved faster than she expected. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe this was always where something like this ended up, and the only thing that had actually moved fast was the exposure. Greer came in 12 minutes late. He was dressed better than the night before. Fresh suit, the armor of preparation. But something about his face was wrong in the specific way that sleep deprivation combined with sustained anxiety produces in people who are accustomed to controlling their appearance. He sat down without making eye contact with anyone except his laptop screen, on which a face Nora assumed was his attorney was visible in a small tile. Holt didn't make him wait. "Wallace," he said, "I'm going to ask you directly about the security footage, specifically about the administrative access used to delete files on 14 separate occasions between August of last year and last month." Greer said, "I'd like to defer to my—" "I'm not asking for a legal response," Holt said. "I'm asking whether you did it." A silence that had an audience. The files in question were deleted as part of a records management protocol that— "There is no records management protocol at this institution that authorizes the deletion of security footage while active HR complaints are under review." Holt said it without heat. The flatness was more damaging than heat. "That's not my interpretation. That's the finding of the compliance office, which I asked to look at this at 5 this morning." He looked at Greer for a moment. "I've known you for 11 years, Wallace. I'd like you to explain to me what I'm looking at." Greer looked at his lawyer on the screen. The lawyer said something too low to hear. Greer looked back at Holt. "I'm advised not to discuss specifics of the deletion events at this time." Another silence. Holt nodded once, the way someone nods when they receive confirmation of something they already knew. "All right," he said. "Then let's talk about what the remaining footage shows." The woman with the laptop, her name, Nora had since learned, was Audra Flem, the board's compliance officer, turned her screen toward the table and pulled up a timeline. What followed was 35 minutes of documentation that Nora had not expected to be as specific as it was. The HR complaints were 11 in total, filed over 14 months. 7 were from nursing staff. 2 were from support staff. 1 was from a resident who had since transferred to a facility in Phoenix. The last was from Petra Ndulu, who had been a charge nurse before she resigned. The complaints covered a range of issues: scheduling retaliation against staff who raised safety concerns, pressure to discharge patients before the clinical picture was fully resolved, and in 3 specific cases, documented overrides of nursing assessments by administrative staff with no clinical authority. Flem walked through each one methodically, referencing timestamps and personnel records, and the clarity of the presentation was its own kind of devastation. Not a polemic, not an accusation, just sequence after sequence of documented facts lined up in order so that the pattern they formed was unmistakable. Nora sat and listened and did not look at Greer. She had not filed any of the complaints. She had wanted to, once, about a discharge situation in Bay 7 that had sat wrong with her for weeks. But she had been newer to the department then and had told herself she didn't have enough information to be certain and had let it go. Sitting in this room listening to the details of Complaint 6, which described exactly the kind of situation she'd been thinking about, she understood that she'd had enough information. She just lacked the specific courage that kind of action required. She filed that away. Not with guilt, because guilt wasn't useful here, but with the attention she gave to things she needed to remember. When Flem finished, Holt looked at Petra Ndulu. "Ms. Ndulu," he said, "you've reviewed the documentation?" "Yes." Her voice was steady in the way of something that has made its peace with being in a difficult place. "Complaint 9 in that sequence was mine. I filed it in February. I was told by Director Greer's office that the complaint was under review. 6 weeks later, the night before my scheduled follow-up meeting, I was informed that my contract renewal was being declined due to performance concerns. Was there a performance improvement plan? No. There was no disciplinary record of any kind in my file. I had a 4-star performance review 3 months earlier. What did you do? I contacted HR. HR deferred to administration. She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. I spoke to a board member, not present in this room, who told me that these things were complicated and that perhaps I was experiencing the situation as more adversarial than it was intended. A short pause. I resigned. The room was quiet. Do you want your position back? Holt asked. She seemed to consider this carefully, which Nora respected. The question could have been answered automatically. It wasn't. I want the record corrected, Petra said. Whether I return is a separate question. Holt nodded. He looked at Flem. She made a note. What? The meeting ran until 9:47. Nora spoke twice. Once when Holt asked her to describe the events in Bay 2 in her own words, and once when Flem asked whether she had ever personally experienced pressure from administration regarding clinical decision-making. The second answer was careful and took longer than the first, because the honest answer was nuanced, and she wasn't going to flatten it into something more convenient. Greer's lawyer interjected twice during her first answer. Holt overruled him both times, using that precise boardroom tone that functions as a door closed firmly without being slammed. At the conclusion of the meeting, Holt said that the board would convene privately and that a formal response would be issued within 72 hours. He said it with the weight of someone who had already decided on the shape of that response, but understood that process required its own pace. As people filed out, Nora found Petra and Dulu in the corridor. I'm sorry, Nora said. About the complaint, about what happened after. Petra looked at her for a moment. Did you know? Not specifically. I had a feeling about the discharge situation in Bay 7 about 2 years ago. I didn't act on it. Petra nodded slowly. Not in judgment. I know that feeling, she said. It costs something acting on it. More than people tell you it will. Yeah. Are you going to stay after all this? The question was genuine, not rhetorical. Nora thought about it. I don't know yet, she said. Right now I'm going back down to finish a shift I didn't actually end. Petra almost smiled. That sounds right. They went their separate ways. Nora took the stairs. The ER at 9:53 on a Wednesday morning was operating at a medium register, not the controlled chaos of the overnight, not the particular tension of a Friday evening, but the steady stream of the morning that didn't stop just because the institution above it had been undergoing convulsions. A construction worker with a hand laceration, a child with a suspected fracture, an elderly man being assessed for chest pain who kept trying to explain that he was fine, and he didn't see what all the fuss was about. Nora changed into a fresh set of scrubs from her locker, drank half a coffee that tasted like the end of a very long tunnel, and went to work. The shift she was covering ran until 2. She had been awake since 5:30 the previous morning. She was running on the particular fuel that activates when the ordinary reserves are gone. Not energy exactly, but a kind of narrow, focused attention that comes from the body deciding this is what's happening and making the best of it. She was with the construction worker when Marcus came to the bay door. There's media outside, he said quietly. She glanced up from the suture line. How many? 3 cameras, 2 reporters I recognize from local stations, and there's someone from, he checked his phone, the Tribune, National. Keep them outside. Obviously, he hesitated. There's also a call for you, not media, the main line. A Major Ostrowski from the Public Affairs Office at Fort Carson. He's been transferred 3 times and is running out of patience. Tell him I'll call him back on my break. Marcus retreated. The construction worker said, Are you in trouble? Finished about an hour ago, Nora said. Hold still. She finished the sutures, wrote up the aftercare instructions herself because the resident on rotation had his hands full, and moved to the next bay. The chest pain patient, 71 years old, name Harold Beckett, retired electrician, and extremely resistant to the idea that his body could produce situations he couldn't fix by deciding they weren't serious, had clean ECG results but elevated troponin. which moved him from the manageable worry category to the stay and watch category, which he was not pleased about. My wife is going to be very annoyed, he told Nora while she was adjusting his leads. She told me to get this check 3 weeks ago. Then she's going to be annoyed and vindicated, which is worse. He laughed, surprised by it. Are you supposed to say things like that to patients? I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do anymore. We're in a fluid period. She checked the lead placement. Your troponin is elevated. That means your heart has been under stress. It doesn't necessarily mean the worst thing, but it means we need to know what it means before you leave. He looked at the monitor beside him. My father had a heart attack at 68. I know, it's in your intake. She met his eyes, which is why we're being careful. He nodded. His bravado was a front for something he didn't want to name directly, which was a pattern she knew. Men of a certain generation who had learned to treat fear as a character flaw and were therefore always fighting themselves in addition to whatever was actually wrong. Is your wife coming? She asked. I called her. She's on the way. He paused. She's going to be very relieved and very insufferable about it. That's her job, Nora said. She left him with the monitor doing its work and went to check the pediatric bay. The fracture was confirmed at 11:14. The child, a 7-year-old named Simone, who had the particular quiet of kids who've decided that crying isn't going to help and are making do, had fallen from playground equipment and landed with her arm outstretched, producing a classic distal radius fracture that the X-ray tech confirmed without ambiguity. The mother was handling it approximately as well as you'd expect, which was to say, not well, but functionally. She's going to need a cast, Nora said, not using clinical softening language because the mother was clearly someone who wanted direct information. The alignment is good, so we're not looking at surgical intervention. Orthopedics will come down to confirm and fit the cast. How long? The mother had her hand on Simone's shoulder in the reflexive way of a parent who needs to touch their child to confirm they're still there. Cast stays on 6 to 8 weeks. She'll have a follow-up at 2 weeks to confirm the alignment's holding. School? Few days rest, then normal activity within the cast's limits. Nora looked at Simone. You'll get to pick a color. Simone considered this with the gravity it deserved. Purple, she said. Good choice. She left the bay and almost walked directly into Decker. He was wearing different clothes than last night. Same type, dark and unremarkable, but clean. And he had a coffee in each hand. He held one out. She took it. Media's been briefed, he said. By who? Vaughn. His idea, not mine. He put out a statement about an hour ago through his unit's public affairs contact. Named Zeus, named you, described what happened. He paused. It's being picked up. She drank the coffee. It was better than the one from the break room, which wasn't difficult. How bad? Depends on your definition. The statement is clean, factual, no editorializing, but the story has enough elements that people are responding to it the way they respond to things they feel strongly about. He said it clinically, not dramatically. By this afternoon, it's going to be a national conversation. What does that mean for the board process? Accelerates it. Holt knows that if they don't move publicly within 48 hours, the public pressure writes the narrative for them. He paused. That's not necessarily bad for you. It's not necessarily what I wanted. No. He acknowledged this without dismissing it. What you wanted was to go home after shift and eat something real and sleep. That timeline has been adjusted. She looked at the coffee. Vaughn should have asked me. He should have. He knows that. He'll tell you himself. Decker shifted his weight. He's here, actually, in the family waiting area off the main lobby. Drove in from the veterinary facility this morning. Said he wanted to talk to you in person. She thought about Vaughn in the waiting room, and the same man who'd come through the ambulance bay doors 20-some hours ago with a dying dog and shaking hands, sitting now in the generic chairs of the family waiting area surrounded by people waiting for news of their own. Give me 20 minutes, she said. She finished the coffee, checked in with the incoming charge nurse about Beckett's status. Troponin trending down, wife had arrived and was reportedly insufferable in the best possible way, and walked to the main lobby. The family waiting area had beige walls and chairs in 3 shades of blue, which Nora had always found inexplicably depressing. The TV on the wall was on a morning news channel with the sound low enough to be a murmur, and 3 families were distributed around the space in the unspoken arrangement that people observe in waiting rooms, keeping maximum distance while pretending they're not. Vaughn was near the window. He stood when he saw her, the automatic response of someone trained to come to attention, partially suppressed. "I owe you an apology," he said, before she could say anything. The statement, "I should have talked to you first." "You should have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the window. "Because I was sitting with Zeus this morning watching him eat for the first time since the surgery, and I was thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been in that ER last night, and He stopped. "I needed to do something. I didn't think it through." "Okay." "Okay?" He looked back at her. "You've been awake as long as I have, and you made a decision while your adrenaline was still running. I've done worse." She sat down in one of the blue chairs. He sat back down in his. "How is he?" "Good. Better than good." Something in his face opened slightly. The vet said he's one of the most responsive recovery patients he's seen. Said it's like he's decided he has somewhere to be. "He does," Nora said. "Yeah." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of soldiers who have learned to sit with silence. "The commendation came through this morning, Zeus's, the one that's been in review." He looked at her. "You probably already knew that." "Decker told me last night. They're going to do a formal ceremony. Public thing. The unit wants you there." She looked at the TV on the wall, where a news graphic was briefly visible before the screen switched to something else. She thought she saw the words Harwick Nurse, but she might have been wrong. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's not a no." "It's not a no." He nodded. He had his hands on his knees and he was looking at the floor, and she could see that there was more he wanted to say, and that he was deciding how. "After Coast," he said finally, "after you left the service, did it—" He paused, reconsidered. "Was it hard? Switching off all that and becoming just a nurse?" He caught the edge of that. "I didn't mean it like—" "I know." She thought about how to answer it honestly. It wasn't switching off. It was more like, she looked for the right image. Like turning down the volume. All of it's still there. The training, the instincts. It's just not the loudest thing anymore. She paused. Most of the time. He absorbed that. Last night it was the loudest thing. Last night it needed to be. He looked at her for a long moment, and she let him look because she understood what he was doing, cataloging her, in the way soldiers catalog the people they trust with things that matter. She had done the same thing many times. It was a kind of respect, actually, a way of saying, "I see you specifically, not just a version of you." "If there's anything you need," he said, "from me, from the unit, anything." "I know," she said. "I'll ask." She stood. He stood. "Go be with your dog," she said. "He needs you more than I do right now." Vaughn nodded. He started toward the exit, then stopped. "The vet said something this morning when I asked how Zeus was doing on the pain medication." He looked back at her. He said, "Someone packed this wound like they'd done it on a moving vehicle in the dark." A pause. "I didn't tell him he was right." He went out through the lobby doors. At 12:30, the charge nurse handed off, and the pace of the floor shifted into the particular lunch hour rhythm that was slower without actually being slow. Nora was doing chart notes at the station when she became aware of someone standing at the other end of the corridor. She looked up. It was Greer. He was in the same suit from the board meeting. He was alone, which surprised her. She had expected him to have a lawyer shadow by now, or at minimum the clipboard woman, or someone from HR positioned to manage whatever this encounter became. He walked toward her. She put down her pen. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said when he reached the station. He said it in a register she hadn't heard from him before. Lower, without the performance of authority. "Good," she said. "What happened in Ndulu wasn't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I told myself there were reasons. At the time, there were reasons that seemed—" He stopped again. She watched him struggle with it and did not help him through it, because that wasn't her job. "I made decisions I shouldn't have made." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for—" He looked at the floor briefly. "I don't know what I'm asking." "Then maybe don't ask anything yet." He looked at her. "That's generous." given the circumstances. It's not generosity, she said. I just don't have the energy for a scene right now. She picked her pen back up. And I don't think you came down here to have one. He didn't answer for a moment. I came down here because I wanted to see the department, he said. I've been up on the administrative floors for 2 years and He looked down the corridor, at the bays, at the steady movement of the floor. I don't come down here enough. No, she said. You don't. A nurse passed them, glanced at Greer, kept moving. The ordinary continuity of the floor. The board is meeting again at 3, he said. Flem told me to expect a formal recommendation by 5. I know. He looked at her once more, the look of a man trying to calibrate something he doesn't have enough information to calibrate. Then he walked back toward the elevators. She watched him go and felt nothing dramatic about it, just the particular flat quality of a thing that has resolved from confrontation into aftermath, like weather that has passed. She went back to her chart notes. She was 3 notes from finished when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A message from the unit number she'd saved under Decker. Boards moved the meeting to 2. Flem says they have enough to proceed. Be available at 1:30. She looked at the clock. 12:48. She finished the charts. At 1:15, standing in the break room eating a sandwich that someone had left in the refrigerator with a note that said, Nora, eat this, seriously, M, which meant Marcus had ordered it specifically and she was going to remember that, she got a different message from a number she didn't recognize. This is Petra. Something's come up. Can you call me before 2? She put down the sandwich and called. Petra picked up immediately. There's a 4th complaint, Petra said, one that wasn't in Flem's timeline. Where did it come from? A resident named Tamboli. He was here about 2.5 years ago. He filed a complaint with the state medical board, not internal HR, because he didn't trust the internal process. A pause. The state board opened an investigation and then suspended it 11 months ago pending a findings review that never concluded. Why are you finding this out now? Because he called me this morning. He saw the news coverage, and he called me. Petra's voice was controlled but tight. His complaint was about a specific incident. A patient in the ICU who was discharged against clinical advice because of bed pressure from administration. The patient had a secondary event 4 days later. Nora was very still. What happened to the patient? A silence. They survived, Petra said. Barely. They're still managing the long-term effects. Another pause. Tamboli has documentation. The original complaint, the state board's acknowledgement, and internal communications from Greer's office that he says suggest the investigation was influenced. Influenced how? He won't say over the phone. He'll say it in person. Petra paused. He wants to be at the board meeting. Nora looked at the door of the break room. Through the small window, she could see the corridor, the ordinary movement of the floor, the life of the department going forward as it always did. Does Flem know? I've been trying to reach her. She's not picking up. Try Holt directly, Nora said. His contact should be on the board's main line. Tell whoever answers that it's time sensitive. Use my name if it helps. Okay? A pause. Nora, if what Tamboli has is what he says it is, I know, she said. Make the call. She hung up. She stood in the break room with the half-eaten sandwich and looked at the wall. An influenced state investigation. Documentation of administrative pressure. A patient who had nearly died because a bed was needed. This was not longer a story about a dog or a nurse or a photograph from 2016. This was something that had been sitting underneath all of it, waiting in the places where the deleted footage used to be. At 1:27, she walked to the elevator. She pushed the button for the 4th floor. The doors opened at the 4th floor to the sound of voices. Multiple, overlapping, the specific frequency of a room where something has already shifted from discussion into something else. Through the open boardroom door, she could see Flem standing at the head of the table with her laptop open and her expression doing something it hadn't done in the previous session, which was alarm. Holt was on his feet. One of the other board members had his phone pressed to his ear. Greer was not in the room. She pushed through the door. Holt looked at her immediately. Where's Greer? She said. Holt looked at Flem. He was here until about 20 minutes ago, Flem said. He said he needed to step out to take a call. She looked at her laptop. Someone just accessed the patient record system from an administrative login. Whose? Greer's. Flem's voice was level, but her hands on the keyboard weren't. He accessed 4 files in the last 18 minutes, including, she looked at Nora, including the file of the patient involved in the Tamboli complaint. The room went still. Nora looked at Holt. Where are the servers? She said. Sub-basement, he said. But you can't. She was already moving. Decker came out of nowhere, or from wherever he'd been standing that she hadn't noticed, which was a skill of his, and fell in beside her at the elevator. I'll come, he said. I don't know what he's doing. I can guess, Decker said. So can you. The elevator took 11 seconds to reach the sub-basement. She counted those too. The sub-basement of Mercy Ridge Medical Center was the infrastructure level. HVAC units, electrical management, the server room where the hospital's data lived on racks behind a reinforced door that required a key card and a pin. The corridor down there was fluorescent and cold and smelled like recycled air and electrical equipment. And it was not a place that nurses went. They came around the corner and the server room door was open. Not forced. Opened with a key. Greer was inside. He was standing at one of the terminal stations near the rack, a USB drive in his hand, looking at the screen with the focused, rapid expression of a man working against a countdown he'd invented for himself. He heard them. He turned. His expression went through several things very quickly. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been a decision forming, and Nora watched his hand move slightly toward the USB port on the terminal. Don't, Decker said. The word landed in the room like something physical. Greer's hand stopped. He looked at Nora, and in his face, in that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen in him before. Not contrition, not calculation, but the specific expression of a person who knows they have run out of road and is registering that fact for the first time in a concrete way. Not acceptance. The moment just before acceptance. The cliff's edge before the falling. Wallace, she said. His name, just his name, the way Holt had said it in the boardroom, like a hand on the arm of someone walking toward something they can't take back. His hand dropped. He took a breath, and in the corridor behind them, Nora heard footsteps. Multiple, coming fast, the sound of people who had been called to a place and were arriving at it, and she knew without turning around that this moment was about to become a different kind of moment, the kind that was witnessed and documented and that would follow Wallace Greer out of this building and down whatever road came after it. She kept her eyes on him. He was still holding the USB drive. Put it on the terminal, she said quietly. Don't make this the next thing. He stood there for 3 seconds that felt much longer. Then he set it on the terminal surface, carefully, like he was setting down something fragile rather than something incriminating. The footsteps reached the door. Nora stepped aside, and Greer sat down on the floor of the server room. Not dramatically, not collapsing, just sitting down slowly with his back against the rack, as though his legs had made a decision his mind hadn't caught up to yet. And put his hands on his knees and looked at the opposite wall with the expression of someone watching a version of themselves they no longer recognize walking away without them. Flem was in the doorway, and Holt, and one of the other board members, and a hospital security officer who hadn't expected this particular scenario and was visibly recalibrating. And behind all of them, a man Nora didn't recognize, older, in a jacket with no institutional insignia, carrying a briefcase, who stopped at the door and looked at Greer on the floor and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "There it is." Nora didn't know who he was, but from the way Greer's face changed when he heard that voice, the specific way a face changes when someone has arrived who you hoped would not arrive, she understood that whatever was in that briefcase was not going to help anyone in this room, except the people Greer had spent 14 months working against. The man looked at her. "Nurse Callahan," he said. "I'm from the State Medical Board's Enforcement Division." He looked at the USB drive on the terminal surface, then back at her. "I've been waiting for an opening to complete our investigation for 11 months. He paused. "I wasn't expecting it to be quite so literal." He moved past her into the server room, and Nora stepped back into the corridor, and the cold fluorescent air of the sub-basement felt different than it had 60 seconds ago, charged with the particular quality of a door that has just opened in a wall that wasn't supposed to have one. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Petra. She answered. "Did you reach Holt?" Nora said. "Yes." Petra's voice was careful. "He told me Tamboli should come in." A pause. "Nora, Tamboli says there are more patients, not just the one. He's been documenting for 2 years and he says there are 3 more discharge cases that he believes meet the same profile." Nora leaned against the corridor wall. The fluorescent light above her flickered once. "How long until he can be here?" she said. "He's already in the parking lot," Petra said. "He drove here before he called me." She told Petra to bring him in through the side entrance off the radiology wing, away from the cameras that had multiplied in the front parking lot since morning. Then she put her phone in her pocket and looked at the open server room door, at the man from the state medical board moving through the space with the careful economy of someone who had waited a long time to do exactly this. And she understood that the next several hours were going to require a different kind of attention than the last 24. Not the focused tunnel of emergency intervention. Something wider. The kind of sustained presence that held a situation together while it finished becoming what it had always been heading toward. She took the elevator back up. Rajan Tamboli was 31 years old and looked like someone who had been carrying a specific weight for a specific amount of time and had developed the posture of a person used to it. He was a slight man, residency-era circles still visible under his eyes, even 2 years out, and he walked into the side corridor with the controlled urgency of someone who has rehearsed this arrival many times in his head and is now managing the gap between the rehearsal and the reality. Petra was with him. She had the expression of someone who had decided this was the thing she was doing and had organized herself accordingly. Nora met them at the radiology wing junction. "I have the files," Tamboli said, before she could say anything. He meant it as both greeting and credential. He was holding a laptop bag against his side, like it was something that might be taken from him. "Everything I submitted to the state board, plus the communications I got through a records request 6 months ago." "Flem needs to see them," Nora said. "She's the board's compliance officer. She's the right person." "Is she—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Can she be trusted?" "I think so." She thought about Flem's hands on the keyboard in the server room, the alarm that had been genuine. "Yes." He nodded, short and sharp. "There's something else," he said. "The 4 cases I mentioned to Petra. 3 of them. The patients consented to being identified if it ever came to a formal proceeding. I have signed authorizations from them. The 4th patient passed away 8 months ago. His daughter has been trying to reach the state board since January." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind the radiology department wall, a machine was running through its cycle, a low mechanical hum that undercut everything. "His daughter," Nora said. "Her name is Sayersha Mulvaney. She filed her own complaint separately from mine. I didn't know about her until 3 weeks ago, when she found me through the state board's public case index." He looked at Nora directly. "She's been trying to get someone to listen to her for 8 months. Nora thought about the shape of that. 8 months of a door not opening. 8 months of a complaint sitting in a system that had apparently been experiencing friction in its review processes around cases connected to Mercy Ridge. "Is she here?" Nora said. "She's in the main parking lot. I told her to wait until I confirmed it was safe to come in." He said it without embarrassment, the word safe in a medical institution, because the last year had apparently taught him that the word applied. "Call her in," Nora said. "Same entrance you used." On. She walked Tamboli to the 4th floor and left him with Flem, who took one look at the laptop bag and immediately cleared the side table with the efficiency of a person who recognized that what she was about to see was going to change the shape of her afternoon. Holt was still in his boardroom. The man from the state medical board, his name, she'd learned in the elevator, was Carver, was on a call in the corner with his back turned, speaking quietly. Greer was no longer in the building. Security had escorted him out through the loading dock at Holt's direction, with instructions not to return pending the board's formal decision. His lawyer was still on the laptop screen, arguing with someone off camera. Nora looked at Holt. "There's more," she said. "I gathered." He didn't look surprised. He looked tired in the way of someone who had spent a long career making decisions, and had learned that the decisions that cost the most were the ones that arrived in clusters. A former resident named Tamboli. He has documentation of 4 patient cases that may represent the same pattern as the internal complaints. Administrative pressure overriding clinical judgment. One of those patients died. His daughter is on her way in. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Nora, he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. I know, she said. It's a lot. I was going to say, how are you holding up? She was genuinely caught off guard by the question. She hadn't expected it from him, and the fact that she hadn't expected it said something about her baseline assumptions regarding people in rooms like this. I'll answer that tomorrow, she said. Right now there's a young woman in the parking lot whose father died, and she's been trying to get someone to take her seriously for 8 months, and I'd like that to stop being her situation. Holt nodded. He picked up the phone on the table and made a call she didn't listen to, and she went back to the elevator. Bam. Saoirse Mulvaney was 26, red-haired, freckled, wearing a work jacket that suggested she'd come directly from somewhere else without going home to change first. She had her father's medical file in a folder under her arm, the original, with handwritten tabs. And she had the expression of someone who had learned that rooms full of institutional authority required a specific emotional armor to enter, and had put hers on before coming through the door. She looked at Nora in the side corridor with the particular wariness of someone who has been told will look into it more times than they can count. You're the nurse, she said. Yes, the one from the news. Apparently. Nora looked at the folder. Can I see it? Saoirse looked at the folder, then at Nora, making a calculation. She held it out. Nora opened it. The records inside were organized in a way that spoke to long hours and methodical effort. Discharge notes, readmission records, the death certificate, correspondence with the state board, and a printed email thread that stopped her cold. The email thread was between 2 addresses she didn't immediately recognize. Administrative accounts, not clinical. But the content was specific. A discussion about a bed management issue on a particular date, referencing a patient by initials, and a response that said, with a specificity that was worse than vagueness, per WG. Move him to discharge pathway. Cardio can follow outpatient if needed. WG Wallace Greer. The patient had been discharged. He'd been readmitted 4 days later with a cascade event that the readmission notes described, carefully and clinically, as a foreseeable complication of premature discharge in the context of his presentation. He'd survived the readmission. He'd declined over the following months. He died in a different facility 8 months ago. She closed the folder. Where did you get the email thread? She said. My father kept everything. Saoirse's voice was steady in the way that took work. He printed his patient portal correspondence and his discharge paperwork, and he kept it all in a binder because he didn't trust digital records after the hospital lost his labs twice in the year before. She looked at the folder. He gave me the binder 6 weeks before he died. He said, if anything goes wrong, there's a record. Nora was quiet. He knew something was wrong, Saoirse said. He knew when they discharged him. He told me it was too fast. He wasn't a medical person. He was an electrician, but he'd been in that system long enough to know the difference between being ready to leave and being told to leave. Nora thought about Harold Beckett downstairs, who was probably still there, whose wife was probably telling him she'd told him so, who was alive and here and arguing about it. Come upstairs, Nora said. I want you to talk to someone who can make this count. Flem spent 40 minutes with Tamboli's files before she emerged from the side room with the specific expression of a compliance officer who has found something significantly worse than she expected and is methodically processing what comes next. She found Nora in the hall. The 4 cases Tamboli documented, she said quietly. 3 of them share the same attending physician on the discharge paperwork. Greer? No. Greer didn't have clinical authority. The discharges were signed by a hospitalist named Dr. Ardell Finch. She paused. Finch resigned 14 months ago, around the same time the security footage deletion started. She looked at Nora. Carver's team found a severance agreement in the administrative files from around that period. Non-disclosure clause. Nora absorbed this. The footage deletions. Ndulu's complaint. Finch's resignation and NDA. Tamboli's complaint to the state board, which had stalled in review. 11 internal complaints that had gone nowhere. Saoirse Mulvaney and her father's binder, waiting 8 months for a door to open. None of these things were individually inexplicable. Any one of them, looked at alone, might have seemed like institutional friction, bureaucratic slowness, the ordinary frustrations of a system too large for its own transparency. Together they formed something else entirely. "Does Carver know about Finch?" she said. "I'm telling him next." Flem looked at the wall briefly. "There's going to be a parallel track here. The board's own action on Greer and the administrative findings, and the state medical board's track on the clinical side. They're separate processes." She met Nora's eyes. "This is going to take longer than today." "I know." Greer's lawyer is already talking about challenging the board's authority to act without a full membership vote. Flem said it flatly, the way you report bad weather. Not surprised, just naming the condition. He's not wrong on the procedural question. The board can make interim recommendations, but a permanent action requires a full vote, Nora said, which requires convening the complete board, which is 7 members, 2 of whom are traveling internationally. She paused. Minimum 72 hours. Nora thought about what 72 hours meant for the public dimension of this. The coverage, the share counts, the national conversation Decker had described. 72 hours in which the story would continue being told without the institution providing its own version. "Is Holt going to make a statement?" she said. "He's drafting one now. He'll release it by 5. Flem looked at her watch. 2 hours. What does it say? Director Greer has been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full board review. The review will encompass HR complaint handling, security record management, and clinical discharge decisions during his tenure. She recited it from memory, which meant she'd helped write it. And a specific acknowledgement of the events of last night. Specifically, Flem almost smiled, which she hadn't done in any of their previous exchanges. That Nurse Callahan's intervention in the emergency department represented sound clinical judgment in extraordinary circumstances, and that her employment status has been fully restored with no disciplinary record. Nora looked at the corridor. "That's good." "It's the minimum," Flem said. "I told Holt it's the minimum." At 3:47, Carver emerged from the boardroom and found Nora sitting on the bench near the stairwell. The same bench where she'd eaten the ambiguous vending machine sandwich what felt like several geological eras ago. He sat down next to her without asking, which suggested he was comfortable with that kind of informality when the formalities were happening in other rooms. "Finch," he said. "Flem told you." "She did." He had his briefcase on his knees. "We've been looking for a thread into the clinical side of this for 11 months. The state board investigation was blocked 3 times. Not formally, not overtly, but slowed, redirected, flagged for secondary review by offices that don't normally touch these cases." He looked at the wall. Someone was managing the timeline. "From inside the state board? I don't know yet." He said it carefully. "I know that Greer had contacts in the regulatory space. He served on 2 advisory committees in the last 5 years. One of those committees interfaces with the board's review process." He paused. "I'm not in a position to name anything directly yet. But you think the investigation was influenced?" "I think the investigation experienced an unusual number of procedural delays that correlate in timing with Greer's committee activity." He looked at her. "Which is a way of saying yes, without the evidentiary basis to say it that directly." She looked at her hands. "What happens to the patients?" she said. "Tamboli's cases. Saoirse Mulvaney's father. Civil exposure for the institution is significant," he said. "That's not my jurisdiction. That's theirs." He nodded upward toward the boardroom. "On the regulatory side, the clinical cases will go through a formal review process. If Finch's license is implicated, and based on what I've seen in the last 2 hours, I believe it will be, that goes to the licensing board. He signed the discharges. Under pressure, possibly, or willingly, or some combination. That'll be determined." He looked at her directly. "It matters which, for purposes of what happens to him. And Greer? That depends on what the full review finds. If the evidence supports a finding that administrative decisions directly contributed to patient harm," he stopped. "I'm not going to speculate out loud." "That's fine." She understood what he wasn't saying. She'd understood it since the email thread in Saoirse's folder. Per WG. Move him to discharge pathway. A direct instruction. With initials. On paper that a man had printed and saved in a binder because he didn't trust that things would be remembered. Some things were worth speculating about. Some things were already clear enough that speculation was just waiting for paperwork to catch up. Holt's statement went out at 4:58. Nora read it on her phone standing in the break room, which was where she'd returned after Carver went back to the boardroom because she needed to be somewhere ordinary for a few minutes. The statement was what Flem had described: measured, institutional, containing exactly what it needed to contain and nothing extraterritorial. The specific paragraph about her employment restoration was the fourth paragraph, not the last, which meant they'd made a deliberate choice not to bury it and not to make it the headline. That was calibrated. She could see Flem's fingerprints on that calibration. The statement also announced an independent review committee with external members, including a patient advocacy representative. It named Saoirse Mulvaney's right to participate in that process. Not by name, her identity was protected, but by category. Family members of patients affected by the administrative decisions under review will be afforded full participation in the independent review process. 8 months. Then today. Nora put her phone down and stood at the break room counter and was quiet for a moment. She wasn't happy, exactly. Happy wasn't the right register for what this felt like. It was more like the specific sensation of a thing that has been wrong for a long time becoming less wrong, which was not the same as becoming right, but was movement in the direction of right, and movement was what you could actually count on rather than arrival. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "How are you doing?" he said. "Asking me that a lot today." "It's been a lot of a day." She looked at him. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, which meant he'd been planning to find her. She took the one he held out. "I'm okay," she said. "Tired." "You've been awake since—" "Don't tell me. It'll sound worse if I know the number." He leaned against the doorframe. "Media's still out front, but 2 of the cameras packed up after the statement." He paused. "The Tribune reporter is still there. She can stay there." She left a card at the desk. She said she's not looking for a comment right now. She said she'd like to talk when things settle. Nora considered this. "Who is she?" "Her byline is Kamaria Osei. She covers healthcare policy." He paused. "She seems like a real reporter, the kind that actually reads things before she arrives." Nora set that aside for the moment. "How's Beckett?" she said. "Transferred to cardiac monitoring. Wife is still there. He was trying to convince her to go home and she was refusing to." Marcus smiled briefly. The resident said they had an argument about it that lasted 20 minutes and ended with her reading him a crossword puzzle. "Good," Nora said. She meant it in more ways than she could articulate. She finished the coffee. Then her phone rang. Not a number she knew. Not unknown either. A Colorado area code, different from Vaughn's. She answered. "Nurse Callahan." The voice was older, female, carefully controlled. "My name is Dr. Renata Voss. I'm the chair of the State Medical Licensing Board." Nora stood up straighter. "I understand you've been in contact with our enforcement investigator, Carver, today," Voss said. "I'm calling because of what has come out of that meeting." "Okay, I want to be direct with you." The voice had the particular precision of someone senior who had decided plain speech was the most effective tool available. "The delays in our investigation of complaints related to Mercy Ridge Medical Center were not random. I've spent the last 3 hours looking at the internal routing on those cases." A pause. "2 members of our review staff have been placed on administrative suspension pending an internal inquiry." Nora was very still. "The delays were managed," she said. "The pattern is consistent with managed delay," Voss said. "I am not in a position to conclude intent from pattern alone. But I'm in a position to act on pattern, which I am doing." Another pause. "I'm calling you because you are currently the most visible person in a situation that has exposed something I should have seen earlier. That is on me." Her voice didn't flinch on that. "I want you to know that as of 3 o'clock today, the clinical review of the 4 cases Tamboli documented has been reopened and assigned to an external panel that does not route through our internal review process." "And Finch?" "Under active license investigation. Suspension pending review is being considered." She paused. "This process will not be slow." "Thank you," Nora said. "Don't thank me. This should have happened 11 months ago." A short silence. "Is there anything you need from my office directly?" "No," Nora said. "I think you have what you need. I believe we do." Voss paused one more time. Nurse Callahan, the work you did last night in that trauma bay was correct. I want that said plainly by someone with the authority to say it. She hung up. Nora held the phone and looked at the break room wall. Marcus was still in the doorway. What? He said. State Medical Board, she said. There were people inside slowing the investigation down. He was quiet for a moment. How deep does this go? That was the question. She'd been turning it over since the server room, since the email thread in Sayerse's folder, since Carver's careful, I'm not going to speculate out loud. How deep? I don't know yet, she said. She put the phone in her pocket and walked back to the floor because there was still shift left and people still needed things, and that was not going to wait for the institutional machinery to resolve itself. At 6:15, Decker found her again. He had a talent for appearing at the points in a day when appearing was most useful, which she had initially attributed to surveillance and had now revised to something more like situational attunement, the particular awareness of someone trained to monitor environments without being noticed in them. Vaughn's going back to the veterinary facility tonight, he said. Zeus is stable enough to transfer to the base facility tomorrow. There'll be a formal review of the training incident at Fort Carson next week. Is Vaughn in trouble for how he handled it, coming here? Decker's expression shifted slightly. There'll be a review. Bringing Zeus to a human facility was non-standard. He paused. The outcome matters in how those reviews go. The outcome here was that Zeus is alive. He paused again. He wanted me to tell you he'll be in touch. About the ceremony. Tell him I know. Decker looked at her for a moment. You doing all right? Everyone's asking me that today. Because it's a reasonable question given the circumstances. She looked at the corridor. Bay 4 was occupied by a new patient, someone she hadn't assessed yet. Bay 6 had just cleared. Marcus was at the desk writing something. The board was still in session on the 4th floor. Carver was somewhere in the building. Sayersha Mulvaney was in a family consultation room with a patient advocate from the board's office, telling her father's story to someone who finally had the authority and the obligation to write it down. I'll be all right, she said. It was true in the way that most honest answers were. Not complete, but directionally accurate. He nodded. Started to move. Decker! He looked back. The photograph, she said. The one from 2016. Does anyone else have copies? He studied her. The original is in the task force archive. The one I used last night came from our file on you. He paused. Why? The Tribune reporter, she said. If she finds it through other channels, she won't, he said. That file doesn't have public pathways. Okay, she exhaled. I'm not trying to hide. I just want to decide what I say about it myself, when I say it. That's reasonable, he paused. When you're ready for that conversation, the public one, there are people who can help you frame it on your own terms. I know, she said. Not yet. He left. She went to Bay 4. The new patient was a woman in her 50s with a wrist injury from a fall in a calm, dry manner that suggested she was accustomed to managing things without making a production of them. She took in Nora's badge, her demeanor, the fact that she'd been the one to come in rather than a resident. Are you the nurse from the news? She said. Today I'm the nurse taking your history, Nora said. What happened to the wrist? The woman looked at her for a beat, then smiled. The small, approving smile of someone who prefers directness. Tripped on my porch step, she said. Honestly, I knew it was a bad step for 2 years. What stopped you fixing it? Kept thinking it was fine. She looked at her wrist. Clearly it wasn't. Nora made a note. Let's get that imaged. She was writing the radiology order when her phone buzzed for the last time that evening. Not a call. An email alert. The sender was an address she'd seen once before. The task force public affairs contact that had sent her the original Decker briefing summary that morning. The subject line was, For your awareness, media inquiry to Fort Carson. She opened it. The body of the email was 2 paragraphs. The first described a media inquiry received by Fort Carson's public affairs office from a freelance investigative journalist, not the Tribune, a different outlet, requesting documentation of Nora's service record under a Freedom of Information request. The second paragraph noted that the FOIA request was legally valid. that Fort Carson's legal office was reviewing which elements of the record were releasable given classification status, and that the review would take up to 30 days. 30 days. She put the phone in her pocket. 30 days in which someone was trying to find out exactly what she'd done and where and with whom, through a channel that existed specifically because information was supposed to be available. She stood in Bay 4 next to a woman with a broken wrist who didn't know any of this was happening, and she thought about what it meant. Not with dread, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone mapping a new terrain. She had never chosen this exposure. She had chosen to move in a trauma bay at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. Everything after that had been consequence, logical, and compounding, and she had understood from the moment she'd taken the call from the unknown number in the locker room that understanding it didn't mean controlling it. Someone was digging. Not the Tribune reporter, who seemed to want her story on her own terms. Someone else. A freelancer with a FOIA request and a different agenda. She thought about what was in the classified portions of her record. The operations. The people. The outcomes. She thought about Reyes, who was probably somewhere in the building still, or gone. She didn't know. She thought about the task force and about what happened to quiet people when the quiet got loud. The radiologist paged her. She walked to radiology. The wrist was fractured in 2 places. Clean fractures, the kind that cast well, the kind that healed completely if you didn't ignore them. She went back to tell the patient. And in the corridor, she passed the elevator bank, and the board-level button was still lit from an ongoing call, and somewhere above her, the machinery of institutional consequence was still grinding forward. And somewhere in a parking lot, a journalist was possibly still waiting with a card. And somewhere, a freelancer was building a FOIA request around the years of her life she had spent the most effort not explaining. She passed the elevator bank and went back to her patient and told her the wrist was going to need 6 weeks and a cast and careful attention to a step she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. "It's never the thing you expect," the woman said. "No," Nora said. "It never is." She went home at 7:43. Not because the shift was fully handed off. There was still paperwork. There was always paperwork. But because Marcus physically took the chart out of her hands at 7:38 and said, "Go," in the voice of someone who has made a decision on behalf of another person and is prepared to defend it, and she recognized that voice because she'd used it herself, in different rooms, on different people, and had generally been right when she did. She drove home with the windows down because the evening air was doing something decent for once, cool without being cold, the particular quality of a Colorado summer evening that justified living at this altitude. She didn't listen to the radio. She didn't check her phone at lights. She drove the 12 minutes to her apartment building on Keswick Street and parked in her spot and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. She made the grilled cheese. It was 11 o'clock at night and she was making a grilled cheese sandwich in her kitchen in her work socks. And this was somehow the most necessary thing she had done in the last 36 hours. She stood at the stove and watched the butter move in the pan and thought about nothing complicated, which was its own kind of discipline. She ate it standing at the counter. Then she went to sleep. The next 72 hours moved in the way that consequential processes move. Not dramatically, not in a single clean sequence, but in overlapping developments that arrived in different registers and required different kinds of attention. On the first day, the board convened its full 7-member session via video conference and voted 6-1 in favor of immediate termination of Wallace Greer's employment as director of Mercy Ridge Medical Center, pending the outcome of a formal misconduct investigation that would run parallel to his termination rather than preceding it. The one dissenting vote came from a member who was a personal acquaintance of Greer's and who submitted a written clarification noting that his dissent was procedural rather than substantive, which was the kind of clarification that clarified nothing but made the person feel better about themselves. The vote was reported publicly by Flem's office at noon. By 2 o'clock, it had been picked up by 14 news outlets. On the second day, Ardell Finch, the hospitalist who had signed the premature discharge paperwork on 3 of Tamboli's 4 cases, voluntarily surrendered his medical license pending review. He did it through a lawyer and without public statement, which was either an act of conscience or an act of strategy, and probably some unresolvable combination of both. The State Medical Board's external review panel convened its first session. Carver sent Nora an email, brief, professional. that said the panel had access to all 4 cases, and that the process, while not fast, would be thorough. She wrote back, "Thank you." She meant it specifically, not generically, and she thought he probably knew the difference. On the 3rd day, the freelance journalist's FOIA request came back substantially redacted. Fort Carson's legal office had reviewed the request and released a summary of Nora's service record that confirmed her rank, her unit designation, her dates of service, and a general description of her medical support role. Everything involving specific operations, specific locations beyond broad regional designation, and specific personnel remained classified. The journalist published a short piece anyway, working from what was available. Decorated combat medic now at center of hospital misconduct scandal, which was accurate in its facts and thin in its texture, and which produced a single news cycle and then receded. Nora read it once and didn't read it again. What she thought about, instead, was the FOIA request itself, the fact that someone had reached for that lever within hours of her name becoming visible. She didn't know who the journalist was working with or for, and Decker had told her in a call on the 2nd morning that the request had the fingerprints of something organized rather than spontaneous. "Someone wanted to know what was in your record," he said. "Not because of tonight, because of before." Before meaning the task force. Before meaning some of the operations you were attached to have generated interest over the years from people who monitor those things. He said it in the flat, informational way he had. "You've been quiet long enough that the interest moved on. You becoming visible again reflagged something." She sat with that. "What do I do about it?" "Right now, nothing. The classification holds. If it changes, you'll be notified before anything becomes available." A pause. "I'd also say, and this is personal opinion, not official guidance, that the best protection for your record is the public version of your story being told clearly and on your terms, before someone else's version fills the space." She'd thought about that for a long time after the call ended. On the 4th day, she called Kamaria Osei. The Tribune reporter met her at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital that Nora had been to twice and felt neutral about, which was why she'd chosen it. Neutral territory. No associations. Osei was younger than Nora had expected from the byline. Mid-30s, natural hair pulled back, a recorder on the table that she didn't touch until Nora said she could. She had a notebook and she actually used it, which Nora noted. There was something to a person who still wrote things by hand in a job that didn't require it. "I'm not looking for a hero narrative," Osei said, from the beginning. "I know that's what people say when they want exactly that, so I'll be specific. I cover healthcare policy. What I want to understand is the system, how what happened at Mercy Ridge happened, and what it means for the structures that were supposed to prevent it." "Then you should talk to Petra Ndulu," Nora said, "and Rajan Tamboli, and Sayoshe Mulvaney, if she's willing. I've contacted all 3. Osei looked at her. "I want to talk to you too, because you're the point of entry. The thing that broke the surface." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend that your military record isn't part of why this story got traction. It is. That's worth examining, not celebrating." Nora looked at her coffee. "Say more," she said. "If you'd been a nurse without a classified service record, the 6 men in tactical clothing wouldn't have come through the front door. The board wouldn't have moved in 72 hours. The state medical board chair wouldn't have called you personally." Osei said it carefully, not accusingly, with the particular precision of someone who cares about accuracy more than comfort. Ndulu filed a complaint and lost her job. Tamboli filed with the state board, and it stalled for 11 months. Mulvaney's father died, and the mechanism that finally moved things wasn't a better system. It was a decorated veteran with connections. She paused. "That's not your fault, but it's the real story." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "it is. Does that bother you?" "It would bother me more if we didn't say it." She looked at Osei directly. "What do you need from me specifically?" "On the record, your account of Tuesday evening, in your own words." Osei picked up her pen. "Off the record, if you're willing, what you think needs to change so that the next Ndulu doesn't have to wait for a decorated veteran to stumble into the same building." It was the right question. Nora recognized right questions. She'd been asked enough wrong ones over the past 4 days to be clear on the distinction. "On the record," she said, and on the second question, on the record too. Osei looked at her for a moment. Okay, she said, and clicked her recorder on. The piece ran 10 days later. It was long, 4,000 words, which was long for anything digital. And it was structured the way good investigative writing was structured, with Nora's account as the entry point, but the actual weight distributed across the institutional failures that had preceded Tuesday night by years. Ndulu spoke on record. Tamboli spoke on record. Sairsa Mulvaney was quoted by name, with her consent, in two places that mattered enormously and were written with the kind of care that made Nora read those paragraphs twice. The piece named Greer directly and accurately. It named Finch. It named the complaint processes that had failed and the review mechanisms that had been slowed. It also named, and this was the part that produced a second wave of coverage, the two state medical board reviewers who had been placed on administrative suspension and the nature of Greer's committee involvement in the regulatory space that had given him proximity to the review process. Osei had done her work. Nora read it on her phone in the break room on a Thursday morning before her shift, and then put the phone face down on the table and sat for a moment. She thought about what Osei had asked her, off the record, and then on it. What needs to change? What she'd said was not elegant, and it wasn't a policy prescription. She'd said, the problem isn't that the system failed in Ndulu. The problem is that the system was designed to make filing a complaint cost more than staying quiet. That's not a bug. Someone built it that way, actively, over time. And until the cost of speaking is lower than the cost of silence, you're going to need decorated veterans and military dogs and 6 men in tactical clothing to move the needle. And that is not a healthcare system. That's luck. She'd paused. And luck runs out. Osei had written it almost verbatim. The formal commendation ceremony for Zeus was held at Fort Carson on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the night he'd hit the floor of Mercy Ridge's trauma bay. The ceremony was smaller than Nora had expected, which meant it was probably the right size. A courtyard, maybe 80 people. A combination of unit personnel and family members, and a few people in civilian clothes whose institutional affiliation wasn't entirely clear. There was no media access. That had been a condition of her attendance, which Decker had negotiated without being asked. She wore her own clothes. Not scrubs, not anything formal. A dark jacket over a plain shirt, the kind of outfit that said present without saying performing. She stood near the back during the official portion, next to Reyes, who had driven down from wherever he'd been and who stood with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did, which was communicating something that declined to be converted into words. Zeus received his commendation from a colonel whose name Nora didn't catch, and when they brought him forward, walking, unhurried, the wound site invisible under his coat, his vest straight and his bearing composed, the courtyard produced a sound that wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite silence. Something in between. The specific sound of people in the presence of something they recognize without being able to fully articulate. Vaughn was at his left side. He'd been at the dog's left side, Nora understood, for 4 years, and would probably be there for whatever years remained, and that was a simple fact that held more weight than it would have looked like from the outside. After the formal portion, Vaughn found her. He looked better than he had in the parking lot of Mercy Ridge 3 weeks ago. The shaking hands were gone. The hollow eyes filled in slightly. He'd slept. He'd eaten. He'd had 3 weeks of Zeus being alive to recalibrate against. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't going to not come." He looked at Zeus, who was circling the legs of someone 20 feet away with the focus of a dog who has identified a person carrying treats and is pursuing this diplomatically. "He's at about 80%, Vaughn said. Vet says 90 by end of month if he keeps the current trajectory." "That's good." "Yeah." He looked back at her. The training facility incident, the review found it was an equipment failure. The fencing material. They're replacing it across 3 bases, he paused. Something like this happens. Sometimes things get fixed that wouldn't have been fixed otherwise. She thought about Petra Ndulu, about Saoirse Mulvaney's father, about what gets fixed and what it costs. "Sometimes," she said. He caught the register. He didn't push past it. "The unit wants to do something," he said, "for you. Not a ceremony. Something," he searched for the word, "practical. There's a discretionary fund for situations where," he stopped. I'm making this sound like a transaction, and that's not what I mean. Vaughn. He looked at her. Tell your unit thank you, she said. Tell them I'm fine. Tell them if they ever need a trauma nurse in a non-standard situation in Colorado, they know where I work. She paused. That's enough. He was quiet for a moment. You know what Reyes told me? He said. After he came back from Mercy Ridge, he said, you moved exactly the same way you moved in the field. Not faster, not slower, not differently. Exactly the same. She looked at the courtyard. Zeus had successfully extracted a treat from the person he'd been working and was now evaluating a second target. Same hands, she said. Yeah. Vaughn looked at the dog. Same hands. Greer's formal misconduct findings were released 5 weeks after the board vote. The report was 23 pages. Nora read all of them, not because she needed to for any official purpose, but because she had been inside the situation and she owed it to the people who had been inside it longer to understand what the official version said. The findings were specific and damaging. 14 months of security footage deletion, confirmed as deliberate and conducted using Greer's administrative credentials. 11 internal complaints inadequately processed, with documented evidence that complaint timelines had been managed to minimize visibility. 3 clinical discharge decisions made under administrative pressure that the panel found had directly contributed to patient deterioration, with 1 case resulting in death. The NDA with Finch, found to represent an improper attempt to suppress clinical concerns. And the committee involvement that had given Greer proximity to regulatory review processes, not proven as direct interference, the language was careful, but characterized as creating a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed and wasn't. The consequences were stated plainly at the end of the report: permanent termination, referral to the state attorney general's office for further review of the patient harm cases, and a finding that Greer was ineligible for future administrative positions in regulated healthcare facilities in the state of Colorado. Finch's license surrender was accepted by the licensing board, and his case referred to the civil track, where 3 of Tamboli's 4 patients had filed suit. Saoirse Mulvaney's family had joined a separate action. The 2 state medical board reviewers on administrative suspension were dismissed following an internal inquiry that found a pattern of case routing that, again, the language was careful, benefited parties with regulatory relationships to Greer's office. The state board's chair, Dr. Voss, released a public statement that was the most direct piece of institutional self-criticism Nora had read from a body like that in her career. It didn't absolve the board. It named what had happened and stated what was changing. Petra Ndulu was offered her position back. She took it. She called Nora to tell her. They offered to make me charge nurse, she said. Are you going to take that too? A pause. I haven't decided. I want to see how the policy changes actually land before I commit to managing within a structure that might still be... She stopped. I want to see what's real. That's smart, Nora said. Are you staying? It was the second time someone had asked her that. The first time she'd said she didn't know. This time the answer was clear, though not entirely simple. For now, she said. I want to see how it lands too. Petra laughed. The small, slightly tired laugh of someone who has been through something and come out the other side and found that other side imperfect, which was the only kind of other side available. For now is good, she said. The thing about being seen, Nora had found, was that it wasn't one event. It was a series of small readjustments that accumulated over time, like eyes adjusting to changed light. The ER staff treated her the same and differently, the same in the ways that mattered, the rhythm of the work, the communication shorthand of people who have shared a floor for years, and differently in ways she was still calibrating. More attention, more weight given to what she said. A resident who had previously talked over her in triage now listened before responding, which was a small thing and also not. She was mostly all right with it. She was occasionally tired of it. She was, on some mornings, unexpectedly moved by it in ways she didn't explain to anyone, because the explanation would have required unpacking things she hadn't fully unpacked herself. She had spent 8 years being no one in particular in a building full of people who didn't know what she'd been before. Some of that had been circumstance. Some of it had been choice, the deliberate choice to fold herself down into the work and let the work be enough, because the alternative was carrying everything she'd done in full view, and she had not been ready for that. She was not entirely ready for it now. But readiness, she had learned, was not always a prerequisite for the thing that happened to you. Sometimes the thing happened, and you found your footing inside it, and that was the version of ready that was actually available. 7 weeks after the night Zeus hit the floor, Nora Callahan received a formal commendation from the Mercy Ridge Medical Center Board of Directors. It was not a ceremony. It was a letter, printed on the board's letterhead, signed by Holt and 4 other members. And it said, in the measured language of official documents trying to carry weight they weren't entirely designed for, that her clinical judgment, her professional integrity, and her conduct during and following the events of the Tuesday evening in question had demonstrated the standard of care and character that the institution aspired to and had failed to sufficiently protect. It said in the 4th paragraph, the board formally acknowledges that Nurse Callahan's intervention saved the life of military working dog Zeus, and in doing so, initiated a sequence of events that exposed systemic failures in this institution's administrative conduct. The board is in her debt. The patients who were harmed and those who might have been harmed had these failures continued unchecked are in her debt. The record should reflect this clearly and permanently. She read it at the nurse's station on a Wednesday morning between patients. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. Marcus was at the desk watching her with the expression of someone who has been trying to read a situation and has given up on getting a full read. "Well," he said. "It's good," she said. "That's it? It's good?" She thought about it for a moment. The letter, the board's words, the weight of official acknowledgement, which was real and also insufficient, the way all official acknowledgements were insufficient, not because they didn't mean anything, but because the meaning of a thing and its documentation of it were always 2 different sizes. "It's the right minimum," she said. He looked at her. "The people who needed to be seen," she said, "are Ndulu and Tamboli and Sayersha Mulvaney. The people who needed to be held accountable are being held accountable. The patients who were harmed have a legal process and people who are finally taking it seriously." She looked at the letter-shaped shape in her pocket. "I don't need a ceremony. I need the floor to work the way it should. That's what I needed before Tuesday night, too." Marcus was quiet. "Does it?" he said. "Work the way it should. Now?" She thought about Beckett, who had gone home to his wife and his bad porch step. She thought about Simone and her purple cast. She thought about Bay 4 and Bay 6, and the morning rhythm of the floor, and the way a 12-hour shift accumulated. Not cleanly, never cleanly, always with something left undone, and something done imperfectly, and one decision that you'd make differently in hindsight. "Better," she said. "Not all the way. Better." He nodded. She went to her next patient. The last thing that happened, not the last thing chronologically, but the last thing that mattered in the way that last things matter, was a text from Reyes. It came on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the courtyard at Fort Carson. She was on her couch with her shoes off and her second cup of tea and a book she'd been trying to finish for 3 months, and the phone lit up on the cushion beside her. "Birchall says hi. He found out through the unit grapevine. He wants you to know he named one of his search dogs after you." She stared at this for a moment. "He named a dog after me?" "He named her Callahan. She's a 2-year-old lab. Very good at her job, apparently." She looked at this for a long time. "Tell him she better be." Reyes sent back a single character that she interpreted as the closest he'd come to a laugh in written form. And then the conversation went quiet. The way conversations with people like Reyes went quiet. Not ended, just paused at a length that might be days or weeks, because there was an understanding on both sides that the thread didn't need constant maintenance to remain intact. She put the phone down. She picked up her book. Outside the window, the evening was doing its thing. The mountains holding their light longer than the sky held its, the specific Colorado dust that she had sometimes forgotten to look at and was trying, lately, to remember. She had been underestimated. She had been dismissed, efficiently and without malice, by a system that processed people by visible credential and surface appearance, and had found her insufficient by both measures. She had accepted the dismissal for years, not because she agreed with it, but because the alternative was spending energy on being seen that she would rather spend on the work. And then a dog hit the floor, and her hands did what they remembered. And it turned out that 8 years of being nobody in particular had not changed what she was. It had just changed who knew. The thing she had learned, or relearned, or confirmed in the weeks since that Tuesday evening was this: the people who carry the most are not always the people the system has been designed to recognize. Ndulu had known this. Tamboli had known it. Saoirse Mulvaney's father had known it. In a binder he prepared because he understood that things needed to be recorded, that trusting the institution to remember on your behalf was a risk you absorbed at your own cost. The system did not change because of Nora Callahan. The system changed a little because Ndulu filed a complaint even knowing what it would cost. Because Tamboli went to the state board even when the state board stalled. Because Saoirse Mulvaney kept calling, kept writing, kept showing up to doors that didn't open for 8 months. Because her father's binder said the record should exist whether or not anyone was reading it. Nora had been the mechanism that moved things, but she was not the reason things moved. That distinction mattered to her. It was, in fact, the whole thing. There are people in every institution, in every department, in every building that processes human beings through a system too large for individual attention. People who are doing the work without the recognition, carrying the standard without the commendation, filing the complaint, and losing the job and driving to the parking lot and waiting anyway. They don't have classified service records. They don't have 6 men in tactical clothing who owe them something. They have their documentation and their persistence, and their refusal to decide that the cost of staying quiet is acceptable. They are the story. The rest of it, the dog, the photograph, the men through the front door, that was the mechanism that cracked the surface. But underneath the surface, the story was already there. It had been there for 14 months, written in complaint forms and deleted footage, and a printed email thread in a binder that a man kept because he didn't trust that anyone was paying attention. Someone should have been paying attention sooner. That was the part that didn't resolve cleanly, that didn't fit into a commendation letter or a board finding or a Tribune article. The part that required sitting with, that was still sitting with her on the couch in the Colorado dusk, with her tea going cold and the light shifting on the mountains. She had moved in a trauma bay. She had done what her hands remembered. And something that had been wrong for a long time became, incrementally and imperfectly, less wrong. That was enough. It wasn't everything. But it was enough to go back to work on Friday, to clip her badge on, to walk to the nurse's station and pick up the first chart of the shift and do the work that needed doing with the same hands in the same building, only slightly changed and not at all sorry for any of it. The badge said, Callahan, N. R. N. It didn't say anything else. It didn't need to.